It's very nice to be here. I was given a mandate to talk both about the general context in which energy efficiency opportunities were being used or not used, and to say something, although I'm much less an expert than many of the people on this panel, on energy efficiency work. I'm here in the capacity as the executive director of a new organization that's not known to many of you, Climate Policy Initiative. We are a small organization. Our offices are overwhelmingly in the emerging markets, although we also have several offices in Europe and a small office in the United States. And I will use some examples a bit further on in this commentary that come out of the individual offices in Beijing and Jakarta and Rio, with which we operate. The purpose of the organization is essentially to help governments evaluate the effectiveness of policies that they are taking, whether those are specifically climate policies or whether they are policies that affect the drivers of emissions, principally, of course, energy and land use policies. Whether or not they are specifically aimed at climate, it's material that has impact on the emissions trajectories that we will tend to concentrate on. We tend to take our mandate or directions from the governments in which we work, rather than creating our own sense of what we ought to do. And when it's possible, we try and work on issues that have a substantial potential to transform an emissions landscape when scaled up, rather than relatively incremental changes in policy. So let me, beginning from the basic question that we try and ask, which is what works in climate change or what works on climate change, come to the context that may be relevant to some of the concerns that people on the panel have been describing. The first thing I would say is that, much to my surprise, having been around this business for 20 years or so, which is a long time in this business, I think most of us expected in the early days of forming the architecture, the policy architecture, especially the international policy architecture that's being discussed around us here in Durban, that the principal policy instruments that would dominate the landscape were essentially regulatory policies that would impose prices. And most obviously, these prices would be imposed either through cap and trade systems, as we have generally found to be the predominant or the preferred instrument, certainly in the international negotiations, or carbon taxes, or other measures that impose cross-sectoral prices. I think one of the surprising things that we have found over time is that a very large part of the policy architecture that we find in much of the world, especially in the emerging markets where we tend to work, is that it has not been those instruments that have driven change. It's much more finance or subsidies, if you will, the use of public budgets that have driven change. And I think in the area of energy efficiency, this is particularly interesting in the sense that the classic argument, as many of you know, is that there are very large negative costs for many energy efficiency activities. And consequently, the classic economics would say, well, you don't need any policy at all to drive this because it is in the interest of households and firms to do it. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that there are a series of problems usually dealt with through information policies or dealt with through organizational changes like ESCOs, who presumably have information that normal households or firms don't have that would correct this. And then after this, you move to questions of liquidity, saying, well, if you do need to put money into it, as Ken indicated, it's a question of making finance available. It's still a perfectly good investment. People don't have the money to deal with the initial capital that's needed. The return is good, so you operate through loans. But in fact, we find that in many places it really is grant finance that is driving energy efficiency as well. So it becomes a question to which Ken was alluding, which is if you have limited public budgets, whether they are in multinational or agencies like the ones represented here, or in national banks that may be driving maybe the sources of this public finance, where should you put the money? Where is your highest return? And that's always a difficult question, but I want to talk about that as one of the principal issues of thinking about effectiveness in this area. And when we do that, I just want to note two other things that are quite important and go to the question of how you do this analysis. The first is, as we all know from being around here, in some ways the rubric under which much of this work goes on has changed over the years. You see much more talk outside these halls about green growth or climate resilient low carbon growth or low emissions growth. And the interesting thing about that is what may be changing is the way or the function that you're trying to maximize when you do investments. So it was in the past, you may be looking at carbon savings as what you were trying to use with your public dollars. It's increasingly a mixture of economic growth, jobs, poverty reduction, and carbon savings, or if you extend green growth a bit further, a variety of other returns from environmental services. So if you think about this as an investment problem or a public investment problem in good part, the function, what you are trying to maximize in investing these scarce public dollars has become a bit more complicated than it was. That always goes to difficulty of doing efficiency or effectiveness analysis. The other thing, which I think is just beginning, and I'll simply point out for those of you who want to follow it out across the next decade, I think we are in a period where, as people start to think what this green growth business means, what they will increasingly focus upon is the fact that, as was alluded to a few moments ago, the great change in the world's economy, which is already starting upon us, is the number of middle-class consumers who are being produced in Asia who have family incomes of somewhere between $50 and $150 a day. That number is going from about 800 million people now up toward 3.2 billion. If you think of what that does to the demand for food and fuel, you can see that resources consumed in these areas are just going to go up in price tremendously. As that happens, if we continue on the model of production that we have today, where in order to grow, you simply consume more and more of your resource stock, you're going to be in a situation where the climate consequences are going to be quite disastrous. So what is obviously indicated here is a shift in economic strategy to not grow through increasing use of your stocks, but to increase the productivity of each unit of the resource that you're using. And I would suspect that the markets are going to drive this first, but climate change is more likely to be dealt with through the problem of looking out ahead at rising resource prices, increasing the productivity with which we use resources, and thereby reducing the amount of byproduct that we call climate change per unit of resource that's actually being invested. What this means, in a strange sense, is if you're looking at the effectiveness of investment, it may be that the best investment for reducing climate consequences is increasing the productivity of the resources that you're consuming. In other words, climate becomes an indirect return on what is really being driven by markets, which is resource scarcity and the need to become much more capital intensive in our resource uses than we've been thus far. Okay, so that's a principal point that I want to make. I want to make two other points. When you actually turn to do effectiveness analysis, it's really hard to do it. I mean, one very good example that I think people can use as an analogy to this is that we have had enormous debates over the last 20 years about the question of the effectiveness of policy spending for development. There's lots of literature about this, and one of the main conclusions is, since we usually, if we have large data sets, try and do this analysis through regression applications, one of the conclusions of the literature is you can run as many regression equations as you want. It depends how you set up the parameters, and your results are going to be indeterminate when you look at the full set of regressions. That's not a very happy result because it says you can't really figure out what is effective in development policy. So people have jumped to the other end of the spectrum and said, well, let's do controlled experiments in which you can get a better sense of what actually may be changing, what is the impact of a policy, but in which generalization is very hard because you may be looking at very specific conditions when you do the experiments. The result of all of this is we're really unsure of our methodologies, and it gets even worse when you start to actually look at effectiveness analyses in particular. So there have been a slew of analyses recently of the Global Fund for AIDS. But we don't really have data about what is happening in the number of people who are getting sick or who are dying. The data are way behind the problem. So what we do is we impose a proxy, which is to say, is a process that we have imagined, a way of governing better the allocation of this investment being approximated in different countries. And we think about our stakeholders involved, and how is the allocation being advised by technical actors. We substitute process for output. And this has become sufficiently common that it dominates a lot of analysis at the present time when you try and do contemporary work. Two more points. I assume what we're really interested in is the cost per unit of whatever it is we're buying, whether it's carbon or some green growth function. But that can be very hard, especially if you use market mechanisms, because the cost of what you're getting in terms of, say, carbon reductions may involve very important transfers of income rather than actual payment of the average cost of making reductions. This is a problem with CDM. If you pay for something that costs 10 cents to produce a ton, but the market clearing price is 8 euros, as it used to be, is that effective policy? You're essentially paying 7 euros and 90 cents, which is just an income transfer, not producing any real change. The 10 cents is all you're doing. So you have interesting questions about the effectiveness of markets in this way. And now I'd like to turn, if I could, just very quickly to 3 studies that we're actually doing, in spite of all of these problems, trying to figure out what is going on in particular cases and close around those issues. So the government of Brazil has recently asked our offices there to look at the problem that Brazil is facing, because since 2005, as many of you know, at least until the first quarter of 2011, the deforestation rate was being reduced very substantially. And the government of Brazil wanted to know what was happening here, what was causing these changes. The government of Norway was also interested because they've been paying for performance through the Amazon Fund, and they were interested as well as whether they were paying for something that they were actually causing to occur. So the work that we've done, which is available at the CPI website, first tried to answer the question, was the change in deforestation rates being driven by price, or was it being driven by policy? And the answer seems to be that up until 2007, the econometric data indicated it could well have been price that was driving it. But after 2007, prices shifted. And they turned up, which should have led to more deforestation if price were the driver. And in fact, the rates of deforestation continued to decline. They declined up until, as I said, the beginning of this year when they turned up again. Why? Well, maybe because political activity began to take place in the Brazilian legislature that threatened the reversal of the policy. Now, having said that, the problem is still more complicated because most of this policy that was announced in changes in 2005, 2007, 2009 was not really implemented. So the question would then be, why should policy that wasn't really being implemented in a serious way cause behavioral change? And so you can see it starts to get into expectations theory or announcement effects that would have caused the change since the implementation was not there. But people, investors, may have been thinking, gee, I'm not going to cut down the forest at this point because they're going to enforce laws that have never been enforced, and even though they're not enforcing them yet, there's been a signal in the policy change. Just as perhaps in the first part of 2011, when the anti-reform movement began to gather strength, maybe that was a signal that the policies were not going to be enforced, and the anticipation started in the other direction. We're now in the process, in the next phase of this work, we'll be trying to break up which of three policies that were enacted over this period of time really seemed to have the biggest effects. There were some conservation units created, kinds of protected zones. There was the enforcement of existing policy, and there were agricultural credit controls that were enacted. And so we're trying econometrically to sort through these three different policies because you've got variation between municipalities that you can use as your database. But it still doesn't escape the problems that I just described of dealing with expectations versus behavior as a causal variable. The other two things, and I will use the chart here that I think are useful in thinking about the problems. If you could advance the thanks. Go back one, please. I'm sorry. This is work that's been done out of our U.S. office, and you can see the question is, what impacts have U.S. residential building energy codes had on household use, on fuel mix, and on household greenhouse gas emissions? And we did this work, as I'll show you, because of course, as you know, in the energy efficiency field, people have argued, like housing codes, people have argued that the problems with these codes, the reason why you would expect them to be ineffective, is that there is a so-called rebound effect. If you drive down the total household budget to be expended on energy through efficiency savings, in effect, it's just going to cause people to consume more. And the other argument is that really these codes are not implemented with any kinds of real sanctions. So why would they affect behavior? And if I could have the next slide. What we did was we looked at the variation among states in adopting these building codes and used regression analysis, as I suggested earlier, with pretty careful attempts to control the statistics for other things that might affect results. And if you could hit the slide again, please. This just shows you the level of the variation among the 50 states in adopting what are reasonably, these are not mandatory codes, but as you can see from the adoption rates, you actually do see a substantial decrease in primary energy being used in total. That you will see a very sharp decline in electricity. You see some increase in the use of natural gas because some of these codes indicate that builders should use natural gas heating as opposed to electric resistance heating. And this gives you a picture of the overall effect on the system. So if you can give me one more slide, please. The interesting thing about the study is that it really indicates that these codes have been effective, even though they were not mandatory in most cases, that they have delivered savings in excess of what the engineering estimates indicated that they would, even though the engineering estimates have no rebound effects in them and no implementation data in them. So either you're getting much more substantial savings than the engineering effects, and there are rebound things that are taking place that decrease the net, or more likely that the rebound effects and the implementation effects really don't seem to matter, at least with respect to new household buildings. And you are getting very substantial savings. And the cost factors and the like will be the subject of the next study, but they are quite favorable. And I'm just going to finish up, and I'm not going to, if you would go through some slides for me, I don't have time to do this. We've done some work in Germany. If you just continue, I'm not going to spend any time on that because I've talked too long already. And I just want to say something about some of the work in China that's being done. This work is really interesting. It's at a different level. If you would hit the next slide, please. This work is all available. It's written originally in Chinese, but there are English translations and summaries, which will be out very shortly on the website. And what it shows you, if you could go about 3 slides further ahead, please. Keep going. Okay. China has had, as many of you know, quite substantial decreases in their energy intensity as well as their carbon intensity across the 11th five-year plan. And by the way, for those of you who are interested in much greater detail about this, one of our young colleagues from Beijing, Ariel Yu, will be presenting this in detail tomorrow at the Chinese Pavilion. What you can see is when we look at the savings, the reductions in energy use, and the reductions in emissions, which I could show you also, over the 5th five-year plan, not reduction in total emissions. Absolute emissions are going up in China. This is reduction in the way the Chinese targets have been set in energy intensity activities in what is obviously a highly growing economy. So this is against a linear 2005 baseline, which some people would criticize, but it is the standard way China measures its savings. What you find out is that there have been very, very substantial savings in energy efficiency. And most of what China is showing as decreased emissions is coming out of this work. But if you go one slide further, please, what you see is that most of this is coming through technological upgrading and updating within the industrial sector. This is not in household sectors for the most part. And then the last thing I would say, and I'll close with this, is that while there are mandates of the type that we saw more or less in the US, where these codes that I was describing as saving on new households, we're actually not producing, we're not financed in any particular way. The difference in China, if we go into the actual financing structures, is that these technology updates and upgrades are being paid almost completely by funding from the state banking system. These are in the large enterprises. So in effect, it's not the mandates that are driving this, it's the financing that's driving it. Why do I say that? Well, it's just a simple argument. If somebody tells you you have to do something and then says, I'll pay you the cost of doing it, my tendency is to say, I don't really know whether the mandate was effective. What I do know is they are paying me the costs that I'm absorbing in this area. So China has been driven in the 11th five-year plan through very, very extensive public funds that have flowed into industry for technological upgrades and updating. Meaning two things perhaps. One, there's a lot of energy efficiency still out there in the household sector and in the small and medium enterprise sector. And two, that even China doesn't have the financing to continue at this scale. And so one of the things that we're doing now is asked by the National Development and Reform Commission is trying to look at the efficiency of public investment flows within the Chinese state banking system to decide whether in the 12th five-year plan this pattern ought to continue or whether there ought to be more reliance on other policy instruments, whether they are sectoral or some of the experimental carbon markets that are now being discussed. I'll stop with that and hoping to contribute in some way to the discussion.